There's been yet another coup in another former French colony, this time Gabon. The country's military has annulled the results of the weekend's general election and deposed the newly re-elected president while shutting off the country's borders.
We, the Defence and Security Forces, gathered within the Committee for the Transition and the Restoration of Institutions on behalf of the Gabonese people, and guarantors of the protection of the institutions have decided to defend peace by ending the regime in place. For this purpose, the general elections of August the 26th, 2023, and its results are cancelled. All institutions are dissolved, including government institutions, the Senate, the National Assembly, the Constitutional Court. We call on the population, the community of the brotherly country settled in Gabon, as well as the Gabonese diaspora, to remain calm. We will reaffirm our stance to respect Gabon's commitments to the national and international communities.
All right, so regarding this breaking news coming to us directly this morning from Gabon, let's hand it over now to local journalist Timothy Obiezu. He has some of the latest details.
During presidential elections that held during the weekend lacked credibility, and because of that, they said they had annulled the elections. They also dissolved all state institutions and shut the borders. Basically, the election, there's been a build-up of, sentiment towards the election. President Ali Bongo's family has been leading, in Gabon for 56 years. Initially, it was his father, who had been leading the country since 1967, before President Ali Bongo came on board in 2009, and he was declared winner of Saturday's election, to continue for a third term in office. So basically, the military leaders are saying that election lacked credibility. That's the main reason why, they announced that coup.
Timothy, what about expectations and potential ramifications that this coup in Gabon could play out? What are your expectations?
Predict what could happen in the coming days, and Gabon is a country in Central Africa. We've seen coups in West Africa, and now we're seeing in Gabon in Central Africa. Basically, another country who were colonized formerly by French authorities. So there is a growing sentiment across Africa. Basically, people demanding just more from democratically elected leaders, and saying that they want better for their countries, they want better for themselves. They want democracy to yield better results. The military leaders there took over power, citing the country's very poor economic status, as well as the issues with insecurity there. So basically, these are people clamoring. And then when that coup happened in Niger, there was some ground support from the people of Niger. So these are people basically seeking for a new direction.
All right, let's get some more details here on RT International. Analysis of the background of this unfolding coup. Let's cross live to our correspondent, Nolovoyo Kunge, who's joining us here on RT International. Vuvu, it's breaking news here on RT, as you well know. We know the ousted president, Ali Bongo, he's been in power since 2009. Okay, he inherited the post from his dad, but what enabled him, I guess, to reign for so long and keep power, even during that mutiny that was back in 2019?
Well, of course, Rory, this announcement for a lot of people does not come as a surprise. They are cancelling the results of the election and dissolving all institutions of republic. Also saying that the country is now in full closure, meaning that borders have now been closed within the country. This is something that they call irresponsible, unpredictable governance, resulting in a continuing deterioration in social cohesion, also risking the leading country into chaos. Now, as in previous election, especially when it comes to Bongo, there were serious concerns about the voting process. The main opposition, in fact, whose name is Albert Ondo Osa complained that many of these processes and polling stations lacked ballot papers bearing his name. And as polls closed, the government announced a curfew and suspension of the internal access for security reasons. As you've also said, both of Mr. Bongo's previous wins, I mean, everyone does say this, were disputed as fraudulent by opponents. This time, controversial changes were made to the voting systems. Now, as you've also just said, that this man did come into power in 2009, following the death of his father. I am suspecting, and I am of the assumption that a lot of people are now getting tired of these long-serving presidents within the African continent. And I think this case has come to that point.
Yeah, Vuvu, we had an analyst on the air just a short time ago, Sandra Ike, a specialist on West Africa, and she was saying that this kind of anti-French or anti-Western sentiment has been building for quite some time now, and now essentially, well, perhaps it's all coming to fruition. Vuvu, Gabon is also, of course, a former French colony. How can we describe the relationship between Paris and Libreville after the latter gained its independence? Obviously, Gabon has oil, petroleum, gas. It's got all sorts of things that France needs every month.
Well, a very complicated one, especially if you consider how Emmanuel Macron has presence within the African continent currently. It's a very complicated one that everyone is talking about. And I think we also need to note the fact that these things have been happening for quite some time. It's just that people have found some way of detaching themselves from these colonies, if I can put it that way, and also just fighting and being able to control themselves. And I think for Gabon particularly, it has seen how other countries within the African continent, be it Mali, be it Burkina Faso, be it Niger, I think it has seen how it can gain its freedom and its confidence by fighting for itself and being able to just stand its ground and not being controlled by these colonies. And I also feel like when it comes to presidents that have been long-standing, those presidents have relationships with these countries that we're talking about. So African citizens and African people are starting to wake up and realize that it's over and they can take matters not necessarily into their own hands, but they can gain freedom and independence without being controlled and suffocated by these colony countries.
Vuvu, you and me were both at the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg just about a month or two ago. We had a great time, amazing coverage, and we met all these different leaders of heads of states from upwards of 50 different African nations represented there. And one of the things that you and we kept hearing from these delegations from Africa was that they're almost emboldened. They're really standing up on their own 2 feet these days. They're looking to an independent future, but they understand that Africa is the breadbasket of the world. And when it comes to its relationship with France, for example, uranium, I mean, so much uranium goes from Niger every month to France because France is basically powered by nuclear energy. So certain European partners have very deeply invested interests in Africa. What would you expect, Vuvu, to be the reaction out of Brussels or Paris or on this Wednesday today?
I really do believe that they will be disappointed because no one is really expecting the fight back and the confidence that African citizens have currently. And I remember many of these leaders talking about independence within the African continent. And I remember particularly one leader saying that the only way to gain independence, the only way for Africa to be independent, the ability for Africa to be an independent, strong continent is for it to be economically developed and sustainable. And the only way to do that is to leave out these controlling narratives and these policies and these reforms that they continue to seek from all these other states. And I think it has really come to that point. And it's really surprising to even see the involvement, or rather how these other states are trying to control and meddle into these affairs, because all these summits, the Russia-Africa summit, the BRICS summit, all of these summits have now really like shed a light to the African citizens and African people to show them that you can become independent, you can be your own people. And the past few days, the conversations were really around Africa also just being its own person and moving away from the policies that make it be so reliant on the world. And I think it's also important, and that question, or rather this conversation, becomes even more special and I think big when you consider how the African continent is dependent on the rest of the world for about 80% of trade and commerce. So it's really become a conversation, a very big one, top and a highlighting one that African countries and African states and African citizens, in fact, want to be independent. And this time, the only way they see and feel the only proper thing to do is really to do this, which for some people does not make sense. But if you are in Africa and are an African, you would really realize that most of these efforts and most of these things that African citizens and soldiers and leaders are doing could be the right way to gain the sort of independence that African people are really gunning for. It is an disappointing conversation to have. It is a disappointing thing to deal with these kinds of Brussels or Paris and all these other states. But for now, it's really come to this point for African citizens and African leaders.
There's just so much moving and shaking happening on the African continent today. I mean, talk about being like one of the main flashpoints on the geopolitical chessboard. RT's Nolivoyo Kunge, it's great to have you on. Thanks a lot for the update on that breaking news. Thank you. Just a short time ago, I was on the phone speaking to Nigerian Pan-Africanist and West African expert Sandra Ike, who says that the situation unfolding in Gabon clearly shows the people's distrust in their government and their strive for freedom.
It's early days. I think that if you look at what's going on, just from what's happening and some of the research that I've done, it seems to me that the people are not with that president, and the president has been, people have been against him and his actions, and the fact that he's actually going for a third term. So I think majority of the people will back the army. Unfortunately, that's not. When we look at democracy and all that, many people would say, okay, it's better not to have, a military government. But Africa at the moment, it looks like the civilian governments that we've trusted our sovereignty with have actually done us no good, and we are not progressing with those kind of structures. So I think now people are fighting a revolutionary fight, and maybe perhaps that's just a way in which people are trying to get power away from those who they seem to be collaborating with people that are not working for the interest of their people.